everyone up to speed. First, thanks for coming. We want this to be a process that gets as much input from as much of the community as we can. Obviously, this is an incredibly important project in a very sensitive site, and we want to do it as right as we can. A little bit of background. Back in the 1980s, the city of Raleigh adopted a master plan for the Mordecai Historic Park, adopted by the city council, and in that master plan, it called for a range of things, not the least of which was an interpretive center that was identified by the task force appointed by the council. It had representation from the Historic Commission, from the Mordecai Board, from the neighborhood. They went through about a year plus or minus process and developed a long-term master plan. And as part of that, as I said, was identified a significant need for an interpretive center. Some of that was implemented. Part of that implementation was the desperate need for some site restrooms, and they were actually built back in the 80s. Some landscaping was identified, a whole host of things. The most significant piece that was not implemented until this point was the interpretive center. Fast forward, if you would, to 2007, was it, Troy, or 8? When was the park bond?
The 2007.
2007. City of Raleigh put together a parks bond referendum, put it to the vote of all the citizens to fund a series of parks improvements across the park system. And one of those projects was the Interpretive Center, finally funded for this project. So 2007.
And I would just point out that some of the discussion I read was that it was passed as a parks bond because parks bonds are always passed. But this center was identified as its own project. It was separate from the parks bond. It was voted as part of the parks bond, but it was not pooled into all the other projects. It was a separately identified piece in the bond.
And from my memory, that bond, as often parks bonds get, got about 80% approval? 75, but overwhelming voter approval. So the funding was put in place for the building. Fast forward again to last year, the City of Raleigh put out a request for qualifications to design teams. Got a bunch of firms to respond, made a short list, interviewed a couple of firms, and our firm, Clearscape, was selected to do the project. What we've been hired to do thus far is to update the master plan. The master plan that's now 25 years old. In that master plan, besides calling for an interpretive center, it located a number of different potential sites for them. One of the sites was the funeral home across the street. And the city at one time flirted with buying it, chose not to. It was sold to a private company. They invested heavily in it, and so that was one of the sites. Another one was the series of empty lots across the street where the spring was. The city actually acquired 2 of those 4 lots, and a private preservation group, Capital Area Preservation, bought the other 2. When we were invited, got a question?
No, go ahead.
All right, we were invited in just to facilitate a very public process to update the master plan. And update the master plan thus far means where should the interpretive center go. That's what we've been hired to do thus far. And so we actually looked at 7 different sites in fairly significant detail. We took those 7 sites to the Mordecai Board and had a conversation with them. We had a community meeting over at the church. That was back in
November, and had a fairly significant turnout that night. Presented it to them because, as all of you know, this site requires a certificate of appropriateness to be issued by the Raleigh Historic Districts Commission. We've had a series of meetings with them. And where we are today is a proposed site has been identified for the building. The next step in that process is to have the Parks and Recreation Greenway Advisory Board. Did I get the acronym wrong? Close enough. They have a meeting on May the 19th for them to look at the proposed site. Okay, we first met with the Design Review Advisory Committee, known as DRAC, which is comprised of former commission members who meet with applicants to offer their opinions and advice. We then met with the commission in February, first meeting? January. Presented in January at the first meeting, had an open conversation with them, got a lot of feedback, and chose to hear the feedback, to pull back, to reconsider issues, came back to the commission in April, and presented again. Between those two meetings, with the feedback from the commission, we met extensively with the Parks and Rec staff. The program for the building got substantially adjusted, reduced in size, divided into two buildings. We met with several, what we think are some of the most experienced preservation professionals in North Carolina, including Myrick Howard, the president of Preservation North Carolina, who has obviously a statewide perspective. We met with
Ed Morris, who's the chair of the Wake County Historic Preservation Commission, and also the executive director of Calvin Jones House in Lake Forest.
and also, I'm sorry, and Linda Edmonston, who at one time was the director of the Raleigh Historic Commission when the master plan was produced, and actually had her office on site here. So we presented all 7 sites to them, sought out their input, and got a consensus view from them of which was the right site. Like I said, in the community meeting, when we start off that conversation, those of you who were there, maybe you can speak to this, there was a lot of questions, concern, probably is a reasonable statement, of why, where is going on. We spent an hour and a half or so that evening talking to folks. At the end, had a vote so we could hear what the community that was presented that night said. Got an overwhelming response to the site we'd suggested, and which doesn't happen very often in my world, especially when you're dealing with projects that have a lot of opinions. Got a standing ovation, which rarely happens. So that's not to say that everybody there was a supporter, but the overwhelming majority felt that we were identifying the right site. Back in the 1980s, there was a long-term master plan developed for this park, comprised of citizens, comprised of the neighborhood, comprised of preservation professionals, comprised of the Mordecai Square folks, and the Historic Commission. Developed a long-term master plan which identified the need of an interpretive center. That master plan was adopted by the City Council. In 2007, as part of the Parks bond, that project was identified uniquely as part of the bond, and 75% of the citizens of Raleigh voted to approve the funding for that project. And so what we're doing right now is we're literally, this first step is updating the master plan. That's what we've been hired to do.
And so the original need was that they need a, what is the reason for the building, for board members to meet and for storage? And, or what is it?
My name's Troy Burton. I'm the site manager of Mordecai. I'll just add to what Steve said. In 1989, that master plan was adopted, and the Interpretive Center was the #1 priority of all the projects identified here in the park. Unfortunately, through time and circumstance and a lot of management issues, the only thing that got built were the 2 restrooms. But we kept that in the back of our minds, and then, of course, Parks took over the property in 2005, and we had 2 additional surveys done by the National Conservation Association. They're actually grant-based, and they also identified the Interpretive Center as the #1 priority for the site. Basically, the highest sort of need we have is conservation. If you go through the house and all of these historic buildings, only 50% of them are actually interpreted as historic buildings. The rest of them serve as offices. They serve as places where we stuff our collection and our artifacts and materials. You can go through the house and see things hidden underneath the beds, see things put in the closets, see things in the wardrobes. And because of the lack of conservation area we have, a lot of those artifacts are essentially degrading and expiring over time, and we just don't have any way to accommodate that need without essentially basically closing the park and just turning this into a preservation mausoleum. If you're going to run it as an active historic site, you have a need for artifact storage, you have a need for offices, you have a need for space, which quite frankly isn't best served in historic buildings. It's essentially using them for an intention that is not their purpose.
So offices.
So what percentage of the building currently is used for administration for offices of the existing building?
Well, 2 of the original 4 buildings aren't even on tour. They're being used for offices and storage. And of the house, about 3 of the buildings are being used, 3 of the rooms are being used for something other than interpretation.
Who has offices in these buildings?
Staff, park staff. We run it as a historic site.
And they work like 40-hour weeks here on this site?
We're open 7 days a week, 361 days out of the year. And
How
only
many-
closed 4 days.
What kinds of activities do these folks do?
We run programs. These folks are me. I'm Troy. I'm the staff. We run programs. We do tours. We have weddings. We do rentals. We run the trolley out of here. We run our garden program out of here. We have docents.
How many visitors a year?
I'm sorry.
How many visitors a year?
When we took over from Capital Area Preservation in 2005, we had 3,600 was the annual visitation. 3,600 a year, and this past year we had over 25,000.
And how many staff are there?
2
There's 2 staff.
2 full-time staff,
2 full-time staff.
4 to 7 part-time staff, depending on when the trolley's running, and then about 200 volunteers.
So the main purpose is offices for the staff?
For the visitor center, is
Yeah.
that what you're?
Yeah, the interpretive center is,
No,
is
the highest priority is the collection.
okay.
But it sounds like it's a trade-off between office space. It sounds like you're using the historic building for purposes that we would rather really not use it for, right?
That's correct.
So there's a trade-off between using the historic properties for offices and storage, it sounds like. Is that right?
Yes,
Versus you'd like to open up that space
and use it the way it's
and
intended.
use it so people can actually see how the house
That's right.
existed.
Yes.
So, I mean, so it sounds like the real need. So it's been presented to the community that the need is for an interpretive center. But in just hearing you speak, it sounds like there's a need for office and storage.
Let me speak to the program. The buildings have multiple purposes. One is a very modest portion is administrative, to free up space in the historic buildings. Another piece is for the archives, for the significant collection that by law has to stay on this block. You cannot take it off of this property. And it is deteriorating because it's not stored properly, because we don't have the facilities for it. And it can't be used for historic research because you can't get to it. A third piece of it is a large multi-purpose room to be able to accommodate the large groups, the classes that come here that now are fine on days like today, but days when it's pouring down rain have no place to meet, to present programs, to talk about the interpretation. So the largest single space is a multi-purpose space that would be used for programming. Fourth is exhibit space, to really create exhibits to talk about not only the Mordecai family and this house, but the other thing that's important about this square, it really is the site of historic preservation in our capital city. Preservation started on this site. The house was going to be sold to a developer. The city bought it. While there's a lot of
feeling today that these buildings that were moved here is not something that we would do given the preservation aesthetic of the 21st century. This was cutting edge preservation back in the 70s and 80s when these were saved and moved here. So it's an ability to talk about the preservation history in the capital city of Raleigh, talk about the Mordecai family and the importance of this place, and why Raleigh is here because of this family and this site. Jump in, please.
Yes, we talked a little bit about the storage and offices. How this building specifically would be freed up with the storage and offices going elsewhere?
Well, I mean, the 3 rooms in the house that are currently being used for another purpose, the 2-door office, which is an original building, which
On
is
the other side of the house?
the storage barn, what we refer to as the Cure Barn, but we use it for storage, would be opened on tour, and then the 2-door, the post office here in the back. So 50% of what we use is not used as a historic building.
Yeah, obviously I see the need for this thing, even though somebody identified the need 25 years ago. It strikes me as, well, maybe it's not relevant now, but I see how it could be relevant. Yeah. To clear up the rooms here, what I don't understand is, why does the building have to be here when it could be in an unused lot a block away if all you're using it for is storage and a couple of offices and maybe a rainy day classroom?
Well, I would say the number one thing, just from a staff standpoint, is safety. Whenever we're bringing busloads of kids in here, and school kids are here 4 days a week, so Tuesday through Friday, we have a traditional, 2 to 3 school buses pull up, and 100 kids come out, and we give them a school tour.
Troy, why don't you comment real quick? I don't mean to cut in, but like how much I've been on the board, and one thing I'd see from the outside is how much effort, like a lot of people use the park for the tours and the schools and stuff. I think a lot of people are just seeing it, think it's a walk to the museum, but I mean they're constantly, serving the whole city. A lot of groups come through here, volunteer groups, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, classes.
Well, I'm not suggesting that still won't come here, but that doesn't mean they're all going to be in that building soon.
But it's hard to accommodate all those people. Is the point.
Well, let's say you accommodate them. What's wrong with those 2 lots?
Well,
You're talking about crossing
let's talk about other sites.
Downtown, they cross those kids over busy streets downtown when they go down to the Capitol building, and you're talking about a little residential street. Come on.
Let me speak to the other sites. I think that's a valid point. We looked at 7 sites. First, the city went to the funeral home and said, would you sell us some? They said no. So one of the original sites.
They didn't say anything. That was the problem. They just blew us off.
So that site is the house across the street's not available. There were 4 lots where the spring is, and arguably the spring site may be the most important historic part of this site. The Mordecais wouldn't be here, wasn't for the spring. Our capital city wouldn't be here if it wasn't for the Mordecais. So the spring, historically, is pretty important. There are 4 sites there. The city owns 2, Capillary Preservation has 2. Capillary Preservation refuses to sell their 2 sites for the use as a visitor center.
Why are they against the visitor center? Why are they against the visitor center?
They're not against the visitor center. They said they won't sell their property for that purpose.
I think it's because it's a natural resource, because it's a spring. I mean, it's of natural historic significance that we preserve.
You know what? Falling Waters is built over a river. We can't build it over the spring?
Given today's requirements that are administered by the Department of Natural Resources, you cannot get but so close to any body of water. Falling Waters is a great example. That building would be illegal in the world we live in today. So if you take the spring site, you take the buffer, that by law you can't touch. The 2 lots that the city owns are not big enough to put a building.
You don't have to touch it if you put a building up on supports.
You're not listening to me. Given the laws that we all have to follow, you can't get but so close to that.
How close?
The buffer.
Go over there and look and measure it off.
Well, we've done the study. Be happy to show that to you. I don't want those documents today, but the site is unbuildable given today's laws.
Well,
okay, I want to see that.
Fine.
I still have a lot of questions about.
Can we get back to the other 2? I mean, you hit 5.
Okay.
Let's not get too far off on a tangent because you hit 5 of the spots. That one, 4 lots over here. What are the other 2?
We looked at 7. The The spring site was one. The corner, we looked at the four corners of the site. That corner there, one of the things we deal with here is obviously the tree canopy we have. And so if we put it in that corner, which was, the corner across from the spring. We looked at that site, it would have a pretty profound impact on trees, and it would be in the front of the house. And so from a historic perspective, what we heard loud and clear from the Historic Commission is something in front of the house was not desirable to them. So that was taken off the table. We looked at the corner over here. And the challenge with the corner over here is twofold. One is because of the distance to the handicap parking. We're required by zoning ordinance to now build a parking lot over here. So it's not just a building, we have to build a parking lot over in this corner to provide the handicap spaces that are required by law. And given the topography change,
you're implying that this building will require no changes in sidewalks and parking.
I'll get to that. I'm trying to work my way around. So I started there. One site, two site, third site requires additional parking. And with the building and the parking, it seemed to have greater compromises. Come over to this corner here. Put a building on this corner means relocating other historic buildings. And given the importance of this in the preservation history of our city, this corner, plus it meant losing two of the most significant trees on the site, seemed to have its own serious compromises. Went to that corner, again, we're in front of the house. And arguably the approach sequence onto the property itself. So, those two front of the house, that one was the creek, or the spring. These two both require additional parking. This one in particular required the relocation of other historic buildings, which left us the site, which is in this area, that was recommended. We also looked at the possibility of putting it in the center of the site and moving the Andrew Johnson house. But again, with the additional parking, all that seemed to be a compromise. Now, to answer your question, in this location, we are close enough, given the law for accessibility, to use the existing handicap spaces that are already on site. Therefore, we do not have to add any more parking or pave any more of the space.
How is that corner more in front of the house than directly in the center of the property when you drive by and you look at Spears House? I mean, in the corner, I don't get it.
How far does the building come right now?
The front of the house is
Well, I mean, that's what everybody sees. You don't see the front of the house because there's funeral home over there. You got to be a Mordecai or Ray Forest to see the house. I mean, the front of the house is great if you're in the neighborhood, but everybody drives by here. If they see it,
on your
go in there and see it.
On your sequence of entering, you pull in, you park, you approach this way. That is the front of the house. It's been the front of the house for over 200 years.
Right, but if you put something in that corner, you drive and you park, you're still looking at the front of the house.
Just responding to what we heard from the Raleigh Historic District Commission, and in their point of view, who are charged by our city council to protect our historic resources, they felt anything in front of the house was off the table. I hear your opinion, but again, we're trying to balance various viewpoints and find a place that, as best we can, protects the historic integrity of the site. You had a question.
You named 5 sites. What were the other 2? You said 7.
1, 2, 3, 4. Spring is 5. Andrew Johnson is 6. And the site we selected was 7.
Andrew Johnson?
One was moving the Andrew Johnson house, trying to get in the center of the site.
I understand. I've got copies of all these meetings if anybody wants to look at it. I understand that, quote, the rental property was considered across the street and they wouldn't sell it. And I would like to know who approached them, what they said, was an actual offer made. I need to get that information. If you don't care to give it out here, I want to know the details on that. Whoever approached them.
Okay.
I'd like to add to that a little bit. You have to remember that all the offset locations, if we built over there, we still can't remove the storage items, archive items, to to the new center because they have to stay on the park. So if we build a building off-site, it does not help us to free up the houses to, for proper
They
setup.
have to stay on the site.
Right.
If that's part of the park, if you make that part of the site, then they will be on site.
No, ma'am.
They have to stay on this lot.
The collection is actually owned by the former managers of this park, and that is Capital Area Preservation. And so they have a long and sordid history with this facility that I'm not going to go into right now.
Okay.
But in essence, they acquired the collection as part of that master plan process in 1989. And so we actually, all of the artifacts, the contents of the buildings, about 90% of them are owned by them, and we actually have, they're on loan to us. And the specification of the loan, it cannot leave this square. And they do not consider the Springs property part of the square.
Are those, what are they exactly? They're pieces,
Dresses, papers,
sometimes on display?
furniture, they're all on display.
They're on display, but you say they're in archives as storage? Or did they rotate? Or?
We would like to, they need to be rotated.
So the idea to keep them on site and you rotate them in exhibits?
That's right. In display.
Okay, but the sounded like really the bulk of the square footage is the multi-purpose room. How is that, those functions satisfied now? What, you said there's like classroom discussions or something?
They just don't exist now unless it's a nice day and you're sitting where we're sitting now.
So when school kids come now, we just have them, unload here, and they all basically, the whole group of them is in front of the house.
And you're just talking about the house or something? What's the reason of the multi-purpose room?
It's primarily programmatic. It's to use as a classroom.
A classroom for when school kids come.
Yes, and also for tours to have an orientation, like a movie,
A movie about what's around them.
About the history of the site.
History of the site. And how big a space is that?
What's the program of that space?
Somewhere between 900 and 1,000 square feet.
1,000. It's like a 5,000 square foot building.
Well, first of all, it's not a 5,000 square foot building.
That's the other piece that has been completely misrepresented by that exchange going back and forth.
Well, that's what's on the Mordecai website.
Well, that was a long time ago.
On the Mordecai website, it seems like what's out on the Mordecai website is very old.
Well, that was a summary of the November public meeting, so it was an article that.
The building has been downsized.
Right.
Still in the same spot.
That was the last time that we.
It's actually been moved a little bit.
Okay. Well,
It's been moved closer to the church.
So what is the square footage?
Further north.
Well, I'm sorry, that plan that y'all are seeing right now on the site, on the CSC's website, it actually shows the buildable area.
Right.
Which is larger than the footprint of the building anyways.
So what is the square footage?
Fred, speak to
The square footage of the Interpretive Center itself is expected to be between 2,700 and 2,900 square feet. As a point of reference, as we're showing it right now, the front wall of the building is probably about the back wall of the chapel.
And how far is it?
It depends on the building's
It's not designed yet.
And then the archives building is between 700 and 900 square feet.
Who's the CAP representative that you talk to? Who's the contact?
The director of Capital Area Preservation is a gentleman named Gary Roth.
And so the multi-purpose is about 1,000, which is about a third of it, and then there's offices.
Exhibit hall.
Exhibit hall.
There are offices.
Offices.
There is obviously mechanical restrooms.
Yeah.
There is a small gift shop to get that out of the house as well, into that space.
Roughly a third of the building is exhibit, a third of the building is multi-purpose, and a third of the building is office, toilet, mechanical, service space.
And you're required to have restrooms in the building by code.
Absolutely.
Well, I guess, I would want to know, again, about the multi-purpose room, like the way that the site is functioning now, that being outside is part of the experience, and also and you have to think about having an interior space that's being used, and how does that balance against the exterior space and how it's being used now? And which has a higher function and value for the city and the neighborhood and the community.
The need for the Interpretive Center has been identified and discussed for 25 years and endorsed repeatedly since then. Just as Troy pointed out, since the Parks and Recreation Department took over the center, it went from, what'd you say, 3,500? 3,600 to 25,000. And with this building, they have great confidence in going from 25,000 serving a much larger capacity because of the ability to provide quality programs in depth that they just can't do.